Tennessee, winter of 1867. The Bellamy estate stood 3 miles past the last farmhouse, where the land turned rocky and the trees grew too close together. Locals called it a gentleman's house, tall, proper, made of pale brick and black shutters, but something about it always felt borrowed, like it didn't belong to the land it sat on. The windows were too high, the halls too quiet, and no matter how many owners came and went, the name Bellamy never disappeared from the deed. Locals avoid the road that leads to it, not out of fear, but a quiet kind of agreement. It's understood without anyone saying so that you don't go up there after dark, not unless you're invited, and even then, you don't linger. They say the Bellamy family came from tobacco wealth, old Southern money, deep as the graves their ancestors are buried in, but none of that matters much anymore. What people remember isn't the business, or the gardens, or the imported chandeliers. They remember the wives, all 6 of them, and how none of them ever seemed to stay. The house has had many owners since the war, but Bellamy, Jonathan Bellamy, was the one who made it silent again. He moved in with his first bride on a windy spring day in 1877. She waved from the balcony. The maid said she looked nervous, even then. Within 2 years, she was gone. No funeral, no obituary, just gone. Bellamy claimed she ran off with a coachman, said she wasn't well, said it was all terribly embarrassing. But she wasn't the last. After the second wife vanished, the town started whispering. After the third, they stopped. Not out of ignorance, but exhaustion. What could you say? That a man might be cursed? That the house itself might be choosing who stays and who disappears? Still, some say at night you can hear bells. Not the church kind, smaller, faint, as if rung by hand, deep inside the walls. Others swear the windows on the east side reflect the wrong sky. And a few, always drunk or dying, have claimed they saw someone watching from the top floor. A woman, or something like one. But when the census man comes around, Bellamy always answers the door. Polite, perfect posture, alone. And the ledger always gets filled with the same line. Head of house, 1. Spouse, none. The estate still stands, quiet as ever. People still call it beautiful. They just don't say it too loud. Not when they pass the gate. Not when the house might be listening. Isabel was the kind of woman people described with soft words. Gentle, sweet, nervous in crowds but graceful in solitude. She came from Norfolk with a pale yellow dress and a voice so quiet you had to lean in to hear her. Jonathan Bellamy met her at a cousin's wedding, charmed her by the fire, and married her that same fall. She moved into the estate before the paint had dried in the upstairs parlor. Neighbors said she brought a certain light to the house, at least at first. She planted white flowers along the walkway and asked the servants to open the curtains each morning. She played the pianoforte in the afternoons, soft pieces that drifted into the garden if the windows were cracked, and for a time the house seemed to respond less creaks in the stairs, fewer drafts in the corners. But by the second winter, the light started to dim. Isabel stopped coming to town. Her letters to her sister grew strange, unfinished sentences, lines repeated. She wrote once that the mirrors in the guest hall didn't reflect her properly. Another time, that she heard someone sobbing behind the walls, even when the house was empty. Servants reported finding her walking barefoot at night, muttering things under her breath, always in the same corridor upstairs, the one Bellamy had sealed after the war. She was no longer playing the piano. She kept a shawl on her shoulders, even in the summer. Then, one morning, she was gone. Bellamy claimed she fled in the night, said she'd taken a train east with money from his study drawer, that she left a note, though no one ever saw it. He told the sheriff she'd grown unstable, that she'd been hearing voices, that she'd wept for weeks before disappearing. But her luggage was still in the wardrobe, her shoes still under the bed, and the white flowers she planted had all turned brittle and black, as if they'd died too quickly. Her family sent letters. They got no replies. The Bellamy estate remained quiet. No search party, no mourning. Some said she never left at all, that she was still in the house, in one of the rooms no one opened. That if you stood in the orchard at night, you could see a woman in yellow on the balcony, brushing her hair with nothing in her hand. And sometimes, only sometimes, there's music, a song with no melody, played slowly, from an instrument no one's touched in years. The groundskeeper, Amos, found it first. He had worked the Bellamy estate for over 20 years and knew every hedge, every stone path, every crooked tree. But one morning in early spring, while clearing out dead ivy near the west wing, his shears hit something solid, wood rotted and warped, but unmistakably a gate. Behind the tangle of vines and thorns was a rusted iron arch, barely visible under years of neglect. The gate creaked when he pushed it, resisting at first, then opening with a groan loud enough to wake the dead. No one had known this part of the grounds existed, not Bellamy, not the staff, not even the land surveyor who mapped the estate a decade earlier. It wasn't on any drawing. It wasn't supposed to be there. What lay beyond wasn't a garden. Not anymore. It might have been once. Long ago, there were traces, the remnants of a cobblestone path, the skeleton of a wrought iron bench, and the twisted remains of what might have been a fountain. But nature had swallowed it whole. Vines choked the trees, weeds split the stones, and something foul lingered in the air. Wet soil, mold, and something sweeter, like spoiled fruit. Amos didn't stay long. He left the gate open and fetched Mr. Bellamy, who arrived with 2 men from town and a lantern. They entered the garden at dusk and didn't return until well after dark. No one spoke of what they saw, but the next day, Amos was dismissed without reason, and the gate was sealed again, this time with iron chain and padlock. Whispers spread. It was the new maid, Claire, who broke the silence weeks later. She said she'd snuck out during a storm, past the hedge, and found the garden unlocked. Said the wind had blown the gate open, though no one could explain how. She didn't go far, only a few steps past the arch, where something pale caught her eye. It was a child's porcelain shoe, perfectly shaped, delicate, but cracked at the heel, half buried in the mud under a dying rose bush. Claire brought it to the kitchen, where the cook refused to touch it. One of the houseboys crossed himself. They swore it belonged to Isabel, that she'd worn a pair just like it the day she vanished. Bellamy said it was nonsense, that the shoe was a leftover from the previous owners, that the garden had always been there. But that night, the chained gate rattled in the wind like someone was pulling from the other side. The cook heard crying outside her window. Claire quit the next morning. And the porcelain shoe, it disappeared from the shelf where she'd left it. Just gone, like it had walked away on its own. Lydia Winslow married into the Bellamy estate on a wet Thursday in September. She was soft-spoken, pale, and carried the air of someone raised in rooms with locked doors. Her dowry was modest, her family lesser known, but Mr. Bellamy, newly widowed, yet oddly cheerful, claimed her presence, restored the house's rhythm. She barely spoke during the ceremony. Some said she looked dazed, as if walking through someone else's dream. Others said she was simply obedient. Mr. Bellamy liked quiet women. After all, ones who didn't ask about locked doors or hidden gardens. 3 days after the wedding, the sound came. A bell, not the estate's usual chime, but a deeper tone, unfamiliar and slow. It rang once at noon, then again at midnight. Locals paused when they heard it. Some thought it was from the church, others assumed a neighboring manor had installed a new bell. But when a carpenter working on the estate stables looked up toward the tower, he swore he saw something new. A second bronze bell, smaller, darker, hanging beside the old one. No one remembered it being installed. There had been no deliveries, no scaffoldings, no laborers. Just there it was. The townspeople started calling it the second bell, and it rang only twice a day, noon and midnight, never more, never less. Each tone carried long and low, vibrating through the bones, even from a distance. Lydia never left the estate after its first ring. She stopped visiting town, stopped writing to her sister. When the milkman arrived, he noticed her through an upstairs window, always facing the tower, unmoving. The house staff said she'd taken to long baths and longer silences. When they asked Mr. Bellamy how she was feeling, he only smiled and said she was adjusting. One maid, Emily, claimed she found Lydia in the hallway one night barefoot, soaked to the skin, though it hadn't rained. She was humming, staring at a wall, whispering something that sounded like numbers. Emily was dismissed the next morning. Soon after, the bell changed. At midnight, instead of one toll, it rang twice, 2 slow notes, stretched like sorrow. No one explained why. When a curious clergyman asked Miss Bellamy directly, he was told, "It's tradition." for every soul that joins the house. Lydia was last seen in November. No announcement was made, no mourning, no funeral, but the bell still rang every day, twice. The Bellamy house is lined with portraits, heavy, gilded frames holding oil-painted versions of one man. Lawrence Bellamy stares out from every hallway, every stairwell, every sitting room. Sometimes he's younger, fresh-faced, standing beside a hunting dog. Sometimes older, seated in a velvet chair, a closed book on his knee. But always alone. When a family friend, Mr. Grafton, visited one summer, he remarked on it over tea. "Odd," he said, letting his spoon clink softly against the porcelain. "There's not a single portrait of either wife. One would expect at least a wedding painting." Bellamy smiled without looking up. They never sat for one. Later that evening, while strolling the upper hallway, Mr. Grafton again commented, this time to a maid adjusting the curtains. "Strange, isn't it? All these walls, and not a single image of Isabel or Lydia." The maid, a thin girl with sleeves too short for her wrists, froze for a moment, then tugged the curtain tight. "They never stayed long enough," she said quietly. He laughed, thinking it a joke, but she didn't smile. That night, Mr. Grafton explored on his own, candle in hand. The house was silent, except for the clock ticking in the foyer. He noticed something peculiar on the west wall, a faint outline, darker than the rest of the wallpaper, as if a frame had once hung there. Beneath it, a slight discoloration, like water damage or smoke. There were more, dozens, in fact. Every hallway bore these silent absences, shadows of what once hung. He traced one with his finger. Dust-free, recently disturbed. The next morning, he asked about them over breakfast. Bellamy folded his napkins slowly, precisely. Decor changes, styles fade, but the hooks are still in the wall. Some things are harder to remove. That afternoon, Grafton attempted to leave early. Something about the air felt too still, like a breath held too long. Before he reached the gate, the maid approached him again, eyes down, voice thin. "They were painted," she whispered, "each one, but they were taken down and burned." "By who?" She only shook her head and walked back toward the garden. Grafton never returned, but in a letter to his brother, written weeks later, he described the unsettling emptiness of the Bellamy home. "It is a place where memory is not preserved but erased," he wrote. "Each room is a shrine to one man's legacy and a graveyard to every woman who entered it. No portraits were ever found, only their ashes in the hearth. At first, the noises were blamed on the wind. The east wing of Bellamy House, narrower than the rest, colder, always a touch damp, had a reputation for draftiness. Guests staying in the smaller rooms there often mentioned a chill, even in the height of summer. The staff said it was the stonework, old and uneven. Nothing unusual. But when Miss Corinne Alder stayed the week of the harvest moon, she heard something different. Not a chill, not a creak. Whispers. She was brushing her hair by the vanity when they began. Faint, as if from behind the wall. Not language at first, just sounds. Quick breaths, tense syllables, then words. "Don't trust him. Please. 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 Get the key." She froze, brush in mid-stroke. The candle beside her flickered. At first, she wondered if it had been her imagination, something stirred by the wine at dinner, or the odd shape of the wallpaper curling in the corner. But the voices didn't stop. They repeated, sometimes overlapping, always soft but urgent, always female. The next morning, she asked Bellamy, casually laughing, almost if the house had any odd acoustics. "The walls," she said, stirring sugar into her tea. "They seem to carry sound in strange ways." He didn't look up from his newspaper. Old houses do that. When she mentioned the voices, he folded a page and raised one brow. "I'd suggest less wine before bed." That night, she drank nothing. Still, the voices came. Closer this time. One pressed so near she thought it might be right at the keyhole. The next morning, she left without breakfast. She wasn't the only one. Mr. Allenby, who came to inspect the estate's library collection, was placed in the same wing. After 2 nights, he refused to sleep there again. He didn't elaborate, but his eyes were sunken with fatigue, and his hands shook when he signed the guest ledger. Only one guest ever described what he heard in full. He was a war veteran, deaf in one ear and suspicious of superstition. But after 3 nights in room 3E, He left a note tucked under his pillow. "I know the sound of panic," it read. "I've heard it in foxholes and trenches. What's in those walls isn't wind." Years later, during a renovation attempt, a carpenter removed a section of paneling in the east corridor. Behind it, an empty crawl space, long and narrow, on the inside of the wood scratches, deep ones, fingernail-sized, some with traces of red-brown residue too old to test properly. The project was halted that same week. Bellamy claimed structural instability. The panel was replaced, but the whispers never stopped. The boy's name was Ellis, and he wasn't supposed to be in the library. He was supposed to be sweeping the second-floor landings, polishing the banisters, dusting the lantern glass. But the library called to him its tall shelves, its hush, the way light filtered through the stained glass skylight like water. So he slipped away when no one was looking and wandered among the books, pretending he was a scholar or a lord. That's when he noticed the stone out of place behind the hearth. One side of the fireplace had a loose brick, thin and hollow behind. Ellis, curious and cautious, pried it open with the handle of the coal scoop. Inside was a bundle wrapped in canvas and soot. He tugged it out, and what fell into his lap was a thick, leather-bound journal, the corners worn, the strap still latched. The initials on the spine were branded in faded gold, J.B. He cracked it open. The handwriting inside was tight, elegant, controlled. It began simply, with dates and estate notes, a dead tree removed, a new horse purchased. Then it changed, entry after entry, night after night, Bellamy's words. March 4th, the second dream in a fortnight. The woman with the pale eyes appears again, standing at the foot of my bed. March 18th, Lydia asked about the bell. I told her it was tradition. She will not ask again. April 20th, cleansing required. The signs were clear wilted violets in the eastern corridor, a crow inside the parlor window. She must be pure before the joining can proceed. Ellis flipped ahead, heart thudding faster now. The entries grew more erratic. June 10th, blood is necessary. Always the hands. Let it drip into the basin. Let her see her reflection ripple. July 1st, she screamed. The second bell rang as it should. The balance is preserved. August 6th, the whispering is louder. They are beginning to align. I must act before the house turns against me. The boy slammed the journal shut and dropped it. The sound echoed against the marble tile. For a moment, the only noise was the slow ticking of the grandfather clock behind him. Then he heard something else, barely a whisper, almost a breath come from the empty hearth. He left the book where it fell and never returned to the library. When asked, he claimed he'd grown bored of reading. The journal vanished by the end of the week. But for months afterward, those who entered the library alone claimed they could feel something just behind the shelves, watching, waiting, as if the house had read its own secrets and remembered them. Her name was Clara Dunn, and she'd only been at the Bellamy estate for 6 weeks when she ran barefoot into the dark, her apron soaked in tears, and something else, something that shimmered like glass dust in the moonlight. She made it as far as the post road before collapsing in front of the Carter family's carriage, screaming nonsense about reflections and hands that weren't hers. Once calmed, she told her story. She'd been dusting the upstairs drawing room, the one with the long mirror mounted opposite the fireplace. A cold room, never used. Even in summer, it smelled like iron. Clara said she saw something in the mirror. Not herself. Not exactly. It was a woman in a white nightgown, moving, but the air in the room was still. Clara said the woman's mouth was open in a silent scream, her fingers pressed against the inside of the mirror as if it were glass from a drowned carriage window. And behind her, in the reflections world, Mr. Bellamy's shadow loomed tall, patient, wrong. Then came the sound. She called it a crack like bone or ice, not mirror. The woman vanished, and Clara saw something drag itself forward through the glass, a smear, a ripple, a hand that didn't reflect at all. She fled. Down the staircase, past the dining hall, out through the servants' corridor without her shoes. The next morning, Mr. Bellamy told the staff that Clara had suffered a fit of nerves brought on by female humors and the loneliness of country work. He paid her final wages in full and instructed the maids not to speak of it again. But the house changed after that. The drawing room was locked. Bellamy claimed the floorboards were sinking and it would be unsafe. Yet, every night, Someone would hear soft taps from inside like fingers against glass. Sometimes, on windless days, the mirror would fog over from the inside. The third wife, Vivienne, was seen less and less. She stopped taking tea, stopped going to town. Some said she was ill. Others said she'd gone home to visit family in Norfolk, though no carriage ever left the gates. What no one could explain was the long scratch that appeared across the mirror the following week, a single gouge, jagged like a desperate nail mark, or how, on certain nights, it looked like there were two reflections in the glass. Vivienne's belongings remained in her room, her jewelry, her slippers, her scent, but Vivienne herself was never seen again. And Clara Dunn, years later, would swear in her final letter to her sister that what I saw wasn't madness, it was a warning. The house doesn't bury the wives, it keeps them, and it uses the mirrors to feed. Her name was Josephine Hale Bellamy, though she signed only J.H. on the correspondence she mailed home. A widow twice over before the age of 30, Josephine was known for her sharp tongue, pressed gloves, and a refusal to be condescended to even by Richmond's most prominent bachelor. She arrived at the Bellamy estate in spring. The garden had begun to bloom again, and with it, so had the whispers. The third wife, people noted, had not been seen since last October. Bellamy dismissed the inquiries as an unfortunate miscarriage, followed by a private convalescence. No one pushed further. Josephine, for her part, did not seem concerned. In one letter, she wrote, "The house is draughty and the staff nervous, but the cellar holds an excellent port, and the orchard smells like old sugar." She walked the trail behind the estate every evening before supper, carrying a small notebook and humming songs no one else recognized. On the 12th evening, she did not return. They found her bonnet near the orchard gate, the ribbons torn, the fabric wet with dew. One of her shoes was discovered half buried in the soft mud beside the pear tree, its heel snapped clean. At first, the staff assumed she had wandered further than usual, perhaps injured, perhaps sulking after a disagreement with Mr. Bellamy, whose temper was known to flicker like oil beneath a calm surface. But when the dogs were brought out, they refused to go past the orchard fence. They howled and backed away, teeth bared at something no one else could see. And when one was forced forward by the groundskeeper, it returned with its coat slicked with sweat and its eyes unnaturally wide, refusing food for days. The search party scoured the grounds for 3 days. No sign of Josephine. The sheriff suggested she had left of her own will, a runaway bride with a taste for theatrics. But her bags were still in her room. Her journal was left open on the vanity, the final page smeared with water, or ink, or something else. Bellamy offered a quiet reward for information and publicly mourned her loss. But privately, he ordered the orchard locked and the garden trail gated with wrought iron. When asked why, he simply replied, "She didn't belong there. None of them do." Later that month, the maid assigned to clean Josephine's room resigned abruptly. She claimed the mirror no longer showed her reflection, only orchard trees that swayed when the real ones outside did not. It would be 2 more years before another woman moved into the house. But by then, the locals had stopped using the name Bellamy Estate. They called it the House with No Wives. The eastern wing of the Bellamy mansion had no doors, only chains. Thick, iron links ran across the entry arch like prison bars, anchored into the stone itself. A rusted padlock held them in place, untouched by key or bolt for over a decade. Mr. Bellamy told guests it was purely for storage, old furniture, moth-eaten drapes, and items of no concern. No staff were allowed inside. No one asked why the hallway behind the chains still had candle sconces, or why, on certain nights, one of those sconces flickered. During storm season, the walls of the east wing groaned louder than the rest of the house. Servants swore the air near the chains turned colder, and some claimed they heard a dragging sound like someone pacing barefoot across the wooden floor, just past the barrier. One young footman, curious after hearing muffled knocking from the wing, peered through a gap in the chains. What he saw made him drop his tray and flee the estate before collecting his wages. When pressed by another servant, he only said they were still wearing veils. Rumors swirled. Some said the wing had once been the original living quarters for Bellamy's first 3 wives, Isabel, Lydia, and Catherine. Others claimed it was where they still lived, A local seamstress who'd visited the house for a dress fitting whispered to her sister that she'd seen a figure in white standing at the far window of the sealed wing, not moving, not blinking, just watching. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, warned newcomers not to mention the east wing in front of Mr. Bellamy. "He gets difficult," she said, in a voice barely above a breath, "and no good ever comes of stirring old dust." One boy, the son of the cook, once dared another to slip a note through the chain links, addressed to the wives. The next morning, the note was gone. In its place was a single strand of hair, knotted into a perfect circle, left on the floor where the parchment had been. Mr. Bellamy never acknowledged the wing except to say, curtly, "It is not safe." And perhaps it wasn't. Because one evening, when the wind was high and the moon sharp, the padlock was found twisted open, not broken, not forced, simply undone. The chains lay coiled on the ground like a serpent at rest. No one went in. By dawn, the chains were back in place, but no one claimed to have restored them. And when the maid lit the parlor lamps that morning, she noticed 5 small muddy footprints on the floor, leading from the wing's direction, then stopping abruptly, just stopping. Cousin Thomas arrived in June, invited from Charleston to escape the summer sickness spreading through the coast. He was cheerful, curious, and spoke often of his love for old architecture. Bellamy greeted him with warmth, if a little too formal, a handshake instead of a hug. The estate, he said, was ancient, not fragile, and the attic off-limits due to pests. Thomas nodded politely, but he'd been raised among skeptics and sailors, and Bellamy's stiff warning only stirred his interest more. By the second week, Thomas had begun exploring the house's many halls and crannies. He marveled at the locked rooms, the cold spots, the portraits of Bellamy alone in every hallway. But what disturbed him most wasn't what he saw, it was what he heard. On the 13th night, just past midnight, Thomas was reading in the guest parlor when a sound broke the silence. A sharp, strained scream. Then another. They came from the attic, not distant, not muffled, right above his ceiling. He froze, waiting for Bellamy to burst in and explain it away raccoons, maybe, or a fallen beam. But the house remained quiet. Still, the next morning, over a pale breakfast of eggs and dry toast, Thomas brought it up lightly. "Odd sounds last night, cousin, from the attic, I believe." Bellamy didn't blink, didn't sip his tea, just placed his knife down slowly and said, "I wouldn't concern yourself with what this house chooses to remember." Thomas laughed nervously. "And if the house remembers something that bleeds?" There was no reply, just a long stare across the table. That afternoon, Bellamy summoned him to the study. The windows were drawn, the ledger desk cleared. On the polished oak was a single envelope thick with folded bills. "I think it would be best if you departed early," Bellamy said. "Tonight, in fact. I've arranged a carriage. You'll find the sum inside more than generous for your inconvenience." Thomas reached for the envelope, then paused. "What's in the attic, cousin?" Bellamy stood, walked to the fireplace, ran a hand along the mantel. "You're asking the wrong question," he said quietly. "The right question is what's still up there." By dusk, Thomas was gone. He never returned, never wrote. But 5 years later, a box arrived at the estate. No note, no return address. Inside, a sketch, charcoal on parchment. It showed the attic window of Bellamy House, and behind the glass, 6 pale faces pressed to the pane, mouths open wide, like they were still screaming. The priest's name was Father Albin. He had been making his circuit through the rural outskirts of Richmond when he collapsed on the steps of St. Bridget's Chapel, boots muddy, robes torn, one eye bruised near shut. They carried him inside and laid him near the altar, where he muttered half prayers through cracked lips and clutched at his coat like a man still running. When they finally unbuttoned the coat to tend his injuries, the letter fell out folded once, stained dark with something that had dried to the color of rust. It was brief, only a few lines, but every word was pressed into the page with a desperation that felt heavier than the blood. "He's taking us through the glass," it read. "We don't know where it leads, only that we don't return. The mirrors hum at night. I've watched 4 women walk through and not come back. Please, if this reaches someone, anyone come before he finds a 6th. No name, no date, but the paper bore the crest of Bellamy House, faint but unmistakable. The priest came to after 2 days of fevered sleep, wild-eyed and nearly mute with fear. He claimed he'd been called to the estate to perform a blessing, something about a family curse. Said the master of the house, a Mr. Bellamy, had been polite but hollow, his eyes like glass left in the cold. He was meant to stay just one night. But after supper, he noticed the mirrors, in every room, facing doorways, beds, hallways, always watching, and in the east wing he heard something else, whispers coming from behind the glass. Not echoes, not tricks of wind, voices, women's voices, pleading in tones too soft to be heard fully, but too urgent to ignore. He tried to leave in the night. Bellamy blocked the door, smiling, said he had one more guest to meet, said the house would introduce them. Father Albin leapt from a second-story window before dawn, broke 2 ribs, ran until the trees blurred. They asked him, later, who wrote the letter. He didn't know, but he remembered the 5th wife, a dark-haired woman named Catherine, who never blinked when she spoke and always looked just past his shoulder as if someone was behind him. She told me something strange, the priest whispered. Said if I looked in the long mirror in the dining hall at midnight, I'd see her waving goodbye. Said it wasn't her hand doing the waving. The letter is kept in the chapel's vault to this day. No one claims it, but every few years, a traveler reports seeing a woman's reflection in the chapel mirror that doesn't match the room, always in a wedding dress, always mouthing the same word, run. The sightings began after the first frost. Hunters passing through the woods behind the Bellamy estate swore they saw her, a pale woman in a wedding dress, motionless in the highest window of the manor's tower. Her veil was tattered. Her face, they said, was pressed to the glass like she was waiting for someone to return. At first, no one believed them. Stories like that always surface around places like Bellamy House. Too much silence, too much ivy, choking the walls. But then came the report from 2 children who'd strayed too close while picking apples. They returned home shaking, the younger one unable to speak for hours. All she could do was point toward the tower and cry. She was smiling, her brother finally said, but not with her mouth. By the 2nd week of November, even the sheriff had seen her. He'd been sent out to investigate a string of livestock disappearances. Probably coyotes, he'd said. But when his horse bucked at the edge of the Bellamy Trail, he looked up, and there she was. White dress, bare shoulders, hair like wet silk, hanging limp on either side of her face. She didn't move, she didn't blink, but her presence radiated something that made his breath stick in his chest. He didn't finish the ride, didn't even go back for his saddlebag. That night, he boarded his windows shut. The town called her the woman in white, like they always do in stories where brides vanish and husbands don't answer questions. Some said it was Catherine, the 5th wife, who had never officially been declared dead or missing, just quietly absent. Others believed it was Isabel, the 1st, finally returned to mourn what became of the others, and some whispered it wasn't any one of them, that it was all of them, faces stitched into one body, veiled together in grief and warning. What unsettled people most wasn't the sightings themselves, it was the pattern. The woman always appeared on the 13th night of the month, always in the same window, always after midnight. She never moved, until she did. One farmer reported seeing her raise her hand slowly, not to wave, but to press her palm against the inside of the glass, as though testing the barrier. Another, a school teacher walking home late, claimed he saw her lift her chin and mouth something. He couldn't hear it, but he read the shape of the words. It wasn't help, it wasn't run. It was, look behind you. He never walked that road again. And every month since, on the 13th night, that top window stays lit, though the manor hasn't had electricity in decades. The mirror was meant to be decorative, ornate, its golden frame curled with carved ivy and strange initials no one recognized. It hung at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway, the one guests avoided, the one that never seemed to hold heat, no matter how many fireplaces were lit. For years, it was just there, cold, watching. It wasn't until restoration workers were brought in to stabilize the rotting plaster that someone finally touched it. It didn't give like glass. It didn't chill the fingertips like a mirror should. It pulsed, faintly warm. A soundless vibration ran through the palm. The worker froze, then pushed. The mirror didn't crack. It opened. It groaned inward like a heavy wardrobe door. Behind it, not plaster, not brick, a passage, barely wide enough for one person. Air spilled out, damp and metallic. The worker called for backup. Inside, the walls were stone but not smooth. They were covered in scratches, not random clawing, but intentional, like someone had been trying to write. Names, some half-spelled, others deeply carved: Lydia, Catherine, Isabel, and one that had never been listed in any estate registry: Edith. Beneath each name were dates. Most had no exit date. Further in, the passage bent sharply, leading to a claustrophobic chamber. A small stool, a broken hand mirror, a silver comb snapped in half. Everything covered in dust, but undisturbed, as if the air itself had been holding its breath. On the far wall, a message etched deeper than the rest. He walks past. He does not see us. But the mirror always does. The restoration team took photos, called the Historical Society, then sealed the passage until further review. But two of the workers never returned after lunch. Both left mid-shift, never collected their pay, never answered calls. One left a voicemail, 4 seconds of static followed by a single word: names. Locals remembered old legends about Bellamy's mirror, but most had brushed them off. Now, with proof, with dates and artifacts, and those desperate scratched names, the story changed. The mirror wasn't just a passage. It was a door with only one side that opened. And someone or something had been watching from behind it for far longer than anyone dared to guess. The final chilling detail? When officials returned days later to investigate further, the mirror was gone. Frame and all. In its place, a blank wall, smooth, clean, and warm to the touch. Clara was not like the others. She arrived in early spring, when the frost still kissed the windows of the Bellamy house and the orchard trees stood black and lifeless. She had married for status, not for love, that much she would admit, but she wasn't naive. She noticed things, quiet things. The bell in the tower rang the morning after her wedding. A sixth bell, newly cast, too heavy to swing without purpose. No one explained it. No one asked. On her third night, Clara reached to lock her door. The bolt was on the outside. She laughed at first, thinking it a quirk of the house's old design. But the unease didn't leave. She tested the theory again the next day. Every bedroom in the west wing had locks all on the hallway side, except Mr. Bellamy's. His door locked from within. Clara didn't confront him. Instead, she watched. Bellamy walked the halls late. He whispered things she couldn't hear into mirrors and paused outside empty rooms, as if listening for breath. He never mentioned his previous wives. Their names were never spoken, their portraits never hung, she asked once. He smiled, thinly, and said, "Some women grow restless in a place like this." The staff avoided her. The maid who dressed her hair trembled if she looked her in the eye. One night, Clara feigned sleep and saw the housekeeper tiptoe in to remove her water glass and replace it with another. The new glass had no condensation. It hadn't come from the kitchen. She poured it into a potted fern. The plant wilted by morning. Clara began keeping notes in a small book she hid beneath a loose floorboard. She marked every creak, every changed mirror, every door that suddenly opened when no wind blew. She traced the lines of ivy outside her window and realized they grew only around the third floor and always toward the glass. Then came the tapping. Soft, rhythmic. From behind her wardrobe, she pulled it away and found a seam in the wall almost invisible, just wide enough to fit a woman's body, and carved beneath the seam, written shallow but certain, were 5 names. Clara's was the 6th. She ran that night, barefoot, carrying only her journal and a candle. But the house shifted. The doors she knew opened into walls. The staircase twisted, and in the top tower window, she saw her reflection wave. The candle went out. No one saw Clara Bellamy again. But in the following weeks, guests noticed something strange. The bell tower no longer rang. It hummed. The fire was Clara's final plan. She'd spent weeks testing every exit, mapping every hidden passage, memorizing when the staff changed shifts. But Bellamy was always a step ahead. The halls rearranged themselves. The garden gate, once rusted open, was now welded shut. The iron bell rang without touch whenever she approached the east wing. And the locks always from the outside, so Clara did what desperate women do when no one listens. She lit the drapes with a stolen match. The fire caught fast, devouring curtains, linens, and the worn edges of the wooden floorboards. Smoke poured out of the manor's west wing before midnight, curling into the spring night sky like a signal flare. The local fire brigade, summoned by a passing traveler who saw the glow from the hills, arrived within the hour. Bellamy stood calmly on the lawn. He told them his wife had gone mad, that she'd locked herself in, set fire to the room, and vanished into the woods. She was never well, he said. These things happen. But when the smoke cleared and the embers settled, the story no longer held. Behind the old coal furnace in the west wing, a section of the wall had buckled. Firefighters found a false panel, and behind that, ash, bone, a scrap of silk lace untouched by flame, and beneath the soot, the faintest shape of a handprint burned into the stone. The coroner's report was inconclusive. The remains were small, fragmented, animal bones, perhaps, mixed with something older. Bellamy claimed the space had once been used for trash disposal, but the fire chief, a man named Wallace Briggs, never forgot what he saw. 6 tiny tooth caps, a cracked porcelain button, and embedded in the brick, something far harder to explain, a human fingernail. 1 week later, the Bellamy house reopened as if nothing had happened. The west wing was sealed. The iron bell rang again at dawn. But the air had shifted. The maids refused to clean the tower room. The cook claimed her utensils moved during the night, and guests reported hearing footsteps in the attic, not slow or heavy, but frantic, desperate, as if someone was still trying to find a way out. When asked about his wife, Bellamy offered the same line he'd always used. She left, he said. Some women can't endure the quiet. But those who had seen the fire knew better. The manor had screamed that night. Not from timber or heat, but from something inside that had been trying to leave for far too long, and still couldn't. The trial of Mr. Thaddeus Bellamy drew crowds from across the state. Reporters packed the Richmond courthouse, their ink-stained fingers trembling with anticipation. They called it the case of the century 6 missing wives, one cursed estate, and a gentleman groom who never aged and never mourned. Bellamy arrived in his finest black suit, calm, composed, as if he were attending a dinner party rather than standing trial for multiple disappearances. He denied nothing, but he admitted little. When asked what happened to Isabel, Lydia, Maribel, Anna, Edith, and Clara, he only smiled and said, "They were never mine to keep. I simply returned them to where they were chosen." The courtroom fell silent. The prosecution laid out a trail of unearthed horrors, fragments of clothing, names etched behind mirrors, journal pages speaking of cleansings and mirrored brides. Witnesses testified to screams in the night, locked wings, hidden staircases, and that strange, unmoving bell atop the manor that rang without cause. Sarah Minton, a former maid who'd fled the estate 15 years prior, took the stand with shaking hands. He spoke to the mirrors, she whispered. Said they showed him who was worthy and who was hollow. Bellamy laughed when he heard her testimony. They listened to me long before the jury did. Court officials attempted to order psychiatric evaluations, but no doctor could agree on a diagnosis. Bellamy was articulate, polite, completely sound, and utterly unreadable. One morning, the judge found a mirror placed on his bench before the trial began. No prints, no witnesses, just a single name written in dust across the glass. Anna. The trial stretched for weeks. When the verdict finally came guilty on all counts, Bellamy didn't flinch. As the judge read the sentence aloud, he stared into the gallery with those hollow gray eyes and whispered something no one could quite make out. Some swore, he said, "I warned them." Others, "I'm the last one left." But one juror, a quiet man named Ellis Boone, later confessed that what he heard chilled him more than anything. The House will choose again. Bellamy was remanded to Coldriver Asylum, awaiting execution. He never made it. 3 days before his scheduled hanging, he vanished from his locked cell. Guards swore no one entered, no windows opened, no doors breached. Only the mirror in the far wall, shattered and bleeding into the floor. In its center, a single word, scratched deep into the glass with bone or nail. Clara. No body was ever recovered. And back in Richmond, the Bellamy estate sat in silence. But at dawn the next morning, the old bell rang once. No wind, no hand. Just a sound the town hadn't heard in months, as if something had returned home. The Bellamy estate is little more than a husk now. The roof caved in years ago. Ivy has swallowed the windows, and the iron gates, once polished by servants in crisp uniforms, hang crooked, rust bleeding down the stone like old blood. But in the spring of 2025, a group of urban explorers posts a grainy TikTok that sparks sudden interest. Three teenagers, faces half hidden by hoodies, sneak past the barrier, calling the place haunted gold for views. The clip shows them laughing, teasing each other about ghosts, until the camera cuts suddenly, then resumes. Silent, shaky. They had reached the bell tower. Local police found them sitting on the front steps hours later, trembling. One girl had scratches along her arm, too wide apart to be human. Another couldn't stop whispering, "I saw her. I saw her." Inside the tower, officers discovered strange things. The floor, though dusty, held a perfectly clean square, like something heavy had been recently moved. In the far corner, buried beneath shattered boards and bricks, they found a small, rotted jewelry box wrapped in lace. Inside were 6 delicate gold rings, tarnished by time. Each bore a name etched so faintly they had to be traced with light to read. Isabel, Lydia, Maribel, Anna, Edith, Clara. But it was the mirror that stopped them cold. It stood upright against the back wall, untouched by dust, unsmeared by time. The glass was too clean, too reflective. And in the center, like something pressed from within, was a single handprint, fresh, wet, and unmistakably human. But no one in the group would claim it. The boys refused to speak on record. The girl with the scratches was sent to St. Agnes Mental Recovery Center after claiming she followed us back. Her family moved states 2 weeks later, deleted all their accounts, erased all mentions of the estate. The mirror was removed and taken to a private lab. No fingerprints matched, no residue was found. But in the reflection, according to the technician assigned to clean and catalog it, there was something odd. He reported seeing someone walk behind him during testing. A woman in white, no face. Just the hem of a torn wedding dress and feet that didn't quite touch the ground. When he turned, no one was there. He quit that night. As of this writing, the Bellamy mirror is sealed in storage, under lock and key, classified as evidence in an ongoing cold case. The estate remains abandoned. Yet every few months, someone reports hearing a bell ringing from deep within the woods near Richmond, soft, lonely, and always just after sunset. And each time, locals wonder, is the house still choosing?